This is one of my early astrophotos. I'd read everything I could find. I was following the advice and I had a reasonable setup, and it still looked like this when I finished. Cut to a recent image, same kind of target, same skies, broadly similar equipment, but a very different result. Why? The difference wasn't money. It was realizing that some of what I believed about astrophotography was simply wrong. These are the 7 things I got wrong and what I do differently now. The first thing that I got wrong was believing that better equipment would fix my images. For a long time, even until quite recently, every frustrating result sent me back to the gear: bigger aperture, better camera, more focal length, better filters. What I've come to realize, and it took much longer than I'd like to admit, is that seeing is often the limiting factor, not the equipment. On a night of poor atmospheric seeing, the most expensive mount and telescope in the world will still give you soft, disappointing stars. And I've also realized that perhaps living beside the sea, my seeing is in general limiting me, or is in fact at least a major factor in limiting the quality of my images. The equipment, therefore, wasn't so much the problem, the sky was. This has caused me to completely rethink what I'm doing. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, perhaps I shouldn't focus so much on buying new equipment and I should rethink about adjusting what I do in terms of my imaging and my workflow. And looking at seeing forecasts might also help. Maybe I can also travel to other skies and other locations where I could get better or improved images. We'll see. For now, let's move on to the second mistake. My second mistake was buying a field reducer for my reflector telescope. I'd read that a field reducer would improve my images, sharper stars to the edges, better coverage. So I bought one, and I also thought that I could get around having to buy a different size telescope and change my field of view. It didn't work, not because it was a bad product, it simply wasn't designed for my specific reflector. I hadn't done the right homework before spending the money. The lesson here isn't just about field reducers, it's that astrophotography gear is highly specific. What works perfectly on one telescope can be completely useless on another. Before any purchase now, I check compatibility obsessively, not just in theory, but from people who have actually used that exact combination. Going on a forum like Cloudy Nights as well has been really valuable. Third, and this mistake cost me a lot of clear nights, I believe that switching from my DSLR to a dedicated astrophotography camera was something I could put off. My DSLR was fine. Why spend the money? Eventually, I made the switch, and the difference was amazing. Better sensitivity to hydrogen alpha, lower noise, more dynamic range for faint detail. I wish I'd done it much earlier. The honest version of this mistake is I was waiting until I was good enough to deserve better equipment. That's the wrong way to think about it. The right equipment helps you learn faster. I also think that there was an element of fear too, because I was thinking that as soon as I switched to an Astro camera, I was going to have to change my workflow and I was going to have to connect to my laptop in a completely different way. There'd be so many new things to learn. But actually, when I got down to it, it was all very, very quick. Just a few nights of practice and I was up and running. So there's another lesson there as well. It's often best not to worry too much about changing. As long as you're going to get an improved result, sometimes it's worth the upgrade and taking some time to learn a new way of doing things. That's the only way to improve. Now moving to shooting decisions for mistake number 4, and this one still surprises people when I mention it to them. For a long time, I stopped imaging completely during a bright moon. Full moon coming, pack everything away, wait 2 weeks. What I discovered is that the moon only limits where you point, not where you shoot. If the moon is in the west, your targets in the east are largely unaffected. And once I started using narrowband filters, which are almost completely immune to moonlight, the lunar cycle stopped mattering almost entirely. I was losing roughly 2 weeks of potential imaging time every month for absolutely no good reason. And you don't need to do that. That realization changed my entire imaging schedule. Now I must admit, it really doesn't affect me whatsoever. My fifth mistake is about exposure length. I'd absorbed the advice, like most of us do, that longer sub exposures are always better. More signal per frame, less read noise relative to the data, so I pushed my subs as long as possible. The problem was star trailing. Many people have pointed this out in some of my videos, for example. Images that I thought were pretty good, when really zooming in, you can begin to see the slight blurring and the slight star trailing. Better not to have that. At longer exposures, even with tracking, I was getting stars that weren't quite round. I was then stacking these imperfect frames and wondering why my stars never looked as sharp as I wanted and why my images were slightly blurred. Shorter subs, well tracked, properly culled, gave me better final results than longer subs with subtle trailing. The advice isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. Exposure length only works in your favor if your tracking can support it. Okay, mistake number 6. Let's go into processing now. And this mistake is one I suspect that a lot of people watching this are still making. I believed that stacking as many frames as possible would always give me a better result. More data equals more signal. Mathematically, that's true, but only if the frames are good. I was stacking everything. Frames with small tracking errors and frames that looked okay, but just weren't quite right. When I started culling, actually rejecting the weakest frames before stacking, the improvement was immediate. And I used Cyril to help me do this by actually looking at the maths and filtering out the frames where focus was not quite right, yet they looked okay when I looked at them visibly. Those still needed culling. And the result is that sometimes 50 good frames will beat 100 mixed ones. The quality of data matters as much as the quantity. And now the last one. This is a processing mistake that genuinely changed how I work. For a long time, I stopped stretching my images when my stars started to blow out and overwhelm the image. The stars were my ceiling. If the highlights were clipping, I'd pulled the stretch too far, so I backed off. What I hadn't discovered yet was star separation. Once I started doing this, the whole complexion of my images changed radically. The idea that you can separate your stars from your nebulosity, stretch each one independently, and then recombine them. Suddenly, the stars weren't a ceiling anymore. I could push the nebula data much further and get out much more detail and color. I could bring out the faint structure that I didn't even know was there before, while keeping the stars under control. Looking back at images I thought were finished, I realized I'd left a huge amount of detail on the table. It was there in the data. I just didn't know how to get it yet. So there you go, 7 things that I got wrong. Some cost me money, some cost me months of imaging time, and some I'm still adjusting for now. So I've confessed to all the mistakes. Well, not all of them, but it's quite a few of them that I'm sure that there are many, many more that I could think about. And maybe you can too. Let's be honest. The thing I've come to accept is that the mistakes aren't a detour from this hobby. They are the hobby. The people who improve fastest aren't the ones who avoid getting things wrong. They're the ones who adapt and notice it sooner. I'd genuinely like to know, which of these did you recognize in yourself? Or what's the mistake that cost you the most time or money that I haven't mentioned? Please drop it in the comments below. I read every one and I'd love to engage with you in the conversation. And finally, if any of this was useful, there's much more on this channel. Please do subscribe, and the links to some relevant videos are in the description below. And for now, I'll see you in the next one.